Good evening, everyone. My name is Mitchell Ash, and I have the honor to be the president of the Israel Study Center Vienna, and to begin this evening's discussion with our distinguished guest, Professor Itzhak Gal-Nur. Before we start that part of the evening, I would like to introduce Professor Emil Brix, who is the head of the Vienna School for International Studies, called in German the Diplomatische Akademie, who has agreed to our great pleasure to be cooperating partner for this event, and to ask him to spend a few words of greeting.
It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I welcome you all, not physically, but virtually on the platform of the Diplomatic Academy here in Vienna. Let me say that for us, working with the Center for Israel Studies is something which we do not only with pleasure, but also out of necessity, because it is part of the, as even our Prime Minister says, of the Austrian Staatsräson, raison d'etat, to discuss Israel matters in an academic way, in a political way, in any way, in our societies. One of the many reasons for that is all the former Austrians who had to leave the country and who live now around the globe, and especially also in Israel. The Diplomatische Akademie Vienna is a place where there is always a guest professor coming also from Israel every year. In most of the cases, a political scientist. And we are happy to say that whenever we have political scientists from Israel, he is being highly critical of what's going on in Israel. And I always thought that's a good sign for a democracy if your leading academics are highly critical of what the government is saying. Sometimes in Austria, this is even more difficult to achieve. So I'm much looking forward to Professor Itzhak Gal-Nur expecting me also to tell us what has been achieved and what is still missing in this. I myself much looking forward to that, because I'm convinced that the quality of a democracy lies always in how it can safeguard minorities. What are the instruments and what are the possibilities for society to safeguard minorities? And there you have always the issue: do you want to safeguard the collectivity? Do you want to safeguard the ethnicity? Do you want to safeguard the group? Or do you want to safeguard the individual? I'm a historian of Central European history. I can tell you what the problems that arise out of the basic law of 2018 and which arrive out of the question that you have about 25% of Arabs living in Israel is rather similar to the late Habsburg monarchy situation, where in the Austrian monarchy there was an attempt to legally define those rights and to question the issue whether they should have a right as a collective group or as an individual person. So there's nothing new under the sun, as I would say, and I do hope that we can hear what happens in Israel on this front, and how much has been achieved on safeguarding the rights of minorities. With this, I give back to Professor Mitchell Ash, who will moderate this evening.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. I hesitate to do this, but I will allow myself to make a simple statement of another historian and say that one thing that we can learn from history is that it doesn't repeat itself, but that is a cliche. I would like to introduce Professor Gal-Nur, but before doing so, I need to say a word about our discussion after his talk. There is a chat function in Zoom, and I hope that all of you are familiar with it. And if you would like to raise questions also during his talk, but especially afterwards, and join the discussion, you are welcome to do so. And I will try to follow the chat function and call on you in the order in which you have made your stated your questions. With no further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker. Professor Itzhak Gal-Nur is Herbert Samuel Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was born in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and arrived in Israel with his parents in 1949 as a boy. He studied at the Hebrew University and then received his MA and PhD degrees at Syracuse University, after which he had his academic career entirely at the Hebrew University, but he was also involved in government as the head of the Civil Service Commission in the government of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin from 1994 to 96 and held other government functions as well. He is now senior fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute and has served on the executive committee of the International Political Science Association, and has edited its journal Advances in Political Science, or rather the book series with that title. In 2015, he was awarded the Life Achievement Prize by the Association of Israel Studies. Amongst his latest English publications are The Handbook of Israel's Political System, edited with Dana Blanda, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. The Privatization of Israel, The Withdrawal of State Responsibility, edited with Amir Paz Fuchs and Ronen Mandelkern, published by Palgrave Macmillan also in 2018. And a forthcoming paper entitled Arab Citizens in the Jewish and Democratic State of Israel, about to be published, from which I presume we are going to be hearing an excerpt today. Professor Gal-Nur is to speak with us about the very simple sounding but clearly not simple topic, Arab citizens in the Jewish state of Israel. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening, everyone, and I would like to thank the Center for Israel Studies for inviting me. Once again, I was lecturing 4 years ago, but it was much more vivid, and I'm still getting used after a whole year to the Zoom and to not having contact with the audience, which I usually prefer. Particularly on a subject like that, which is, as you know, rather complicated, and to try and summarize it not always works. But I'll do my best, and then I'll be happy to answer your question, because I'm not going to be able to cover all the subjects. So let me start by, in a way of introduction, saying that Israel has become an unstable democracy. As you probably know, for the last 2 years, we had the privilege of going to the ballot box 4 times, which is strange, because I usually thought that we elect our representatives, but in Israel in the last 2 years, our representatives in the parliament decided that they want to be re-elected time and again, which puts democracy on its head. And I'm thinking maybe we should find a way, we as citizens, of telling our representatives that we are a little fed up with the repeating elections. But in terms of politics of Israel, the combination of the corona plague and the political instability is quite a difficult combination. Yes, and now Israel is on its way of having a normal life, but this is not due, I'm sorry to say, and I'm following your advice, Mr. Ambassador, to criticize a little bit. It's not due to the government, which in the last 2 years has not been functioning very well. It is mainly due to the fact that we still have a very efficient health system based on 4 sick funds, which are non-profit. And thanks to them, I think that we are now where we are. This is a good introduction to say that when we want to talk about the Arab citizens of the State of Israel, part of this unstable situation also includes them. It's not just the Jewish part of the population, it's also the Arab part of the population. And this is reflected in the fact that there are many parties on the Jewish side, but there are also many parties on the Arab side, and I'll say something about it in a moment. One surprising outcome of the, particularly the last election that we had about 20 days ago, is that the legitimacy of the Arab vote, or the Arab voters more precisely, and the legitimacy of the Arab parties has increased, which is quite an ironic thing, because some of the reasons for the situation that we have now were actually attempts to reduce the power of the Arab voters and the power of the Arab parties. As you probably know, the leading Likud party was trying to get Arabs to vote for them, which is quite an unusual spectacle. And now, given the results, which ended again in a deadlock, even now, and I don't know, I'm sorry, even though I'm a political scientist, I'm not be able to say at the moment, what is going to be the coalition, if at all. So theoretically speaking, we may have a fifth election pretty soon. But if not, it so happened that the two blocks, let's call it one, the change block that want to change the current government, and the current government headed by the Likud and Prime Minister Netanyahu, came out in a situation in which neither of them has enough votes to form a coalition. It is 52 for the Likud-headed bloc, and it's 57 for the change parties. Some of them are right-wing parties, but they call themselves the change parties. So it so happened that one little Arab party, which got 4 members in the Knesset in the last election, could in fact swing the vote either way. And this is quite interesting because it is now being courted by both sides. And about a week ago, I saw something which I've never seen before. The leader of this Arab party, Abbas Mansour, was interviewed on primetime television in Israel in all 3 channels, and was given about 10 minutes to state the position of the party. Quite something that we haven't seen before. So here we are now with this unstable thing, and let me tell you what I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes or so. First of all, I'm going to say something about the numbers involved, because even though I'm a political scientist, I like statistics, etc. It's going not to be too long. Then I'm going to go through some of the main events in overview, mainly of the relationship between Jews and Arabs in the state of Israel, point out to the social gaps between Jews and Arabs, talk about Arab politics, talk about government policies, and hopefully I'll have time to state my own view about government policy, my personal own view, which I think is very important. Let me add that I'm personally involved in this subject for many, many years. As the head of the Civil Service Commission, and then later on as co-chair of an organization which works for equality between Arabs and Jews in Israel called Sikui, a chance, for many years. So this subject is close to my heart. I know Arabic, I speak Arabic, and it's not something which I just wrote an article about it. I've been involved for quite some time. And finally, let me say something about the words, I choose the title Arab citizens of Israel. Now, there are different ways of referring to them. Most of the Arabs, or the intellectuals among the Arabs, refer to themselves as the Palestinian Arabs in Israel. Some Israelis call them the Israeli Arabs. which the Arabs don't like because they are not very happy. Some of the Arabs outside of Israel call them the Israeli Arabs of 1948, etc., etc. So a neutral way of talking about is Arab citizens of the state of Israel, which means I'm talking only about the citizens of the state of Israel, the Palestinian Arabs within Israel. I'm not talking about the Palestinians on the West Bank or the Gaza Strip in the occupied territories, okay? It's very important for me to say. As of some numbers, as of I just checked the January 2021 numbers, there are about 2 million Arabs in a population of 9.3 in Israel, which is about 21%. If we do not include East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights and some other disputed areas, then it would be something like 19% minority of Arabs. Again, not an homogeneous population. They are divided into many ways, but the main division is that 85% of the Arabs in Israel are Muslims, 7% are Christian Arabs, and 8% are Druze. Also, within these numbers, we have about 200,000 Bedouins, nomads, in the south mainly, but also some of them in the north. Majority of them, or over 90%, are not nomads anymore. They live in towns and so on. And they are the poorest among the Arabs. I'll come to it later on. Most of the Arabs live in the north of the country, in local and regional councils. And also 34% of them in Arab cities, and about 8% of them in mixed cities. Those of you who know Israel know that Jaffa, Ramle, Akko, and some other places are mixed cities. By the way, this is why some of the numbers regarding the vote of the Arabs are difficult to find, because it's difficult to pinpoint the Arab voter in the mixed cities. So you may, those of you who follow the statistics, may find different numbers, even the one that I mentioned before. I'm going to criticize the Israeli policy toward the Arabs in the last 70 years or so, but I think it would be fair to say that even if we regard the policy as something which leaves a lot to be said, it would be fair also to say that the present relationship, between the state of Israel and its Arab citizens, I would call them ambivalent. On the one hand, the government legislated the law that was mentioned by the ambassador, and I would like also to thank you for coming, and also my Mitchell Ash for chairing this meeting. So on the one hand, the present government legislated the law which is called Basic Law of Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, in 1918. Now, this is a basic law. We don't have a written constitution. We have basic laws, but it should be regarded in the constitution. So this government legislated into our constitution a law which doesn't speak about democracy, unfortunately. It speaks about the fact that the state belongs to the Jews, and it does refer to non-Jews or to Arabs in a way which I find quite disturbing. On the other hand, in 2007, the same government, in 2007 and then in 2009, the same government has invested a lot of money, and lately in a plan, which is a 5-year plan, no less than 15 billion Israeli shekels was allocated to the Arab localities, local authorities, and there have been plans before, not all of them were implemented, in this case, and I'll explain later why it was implemented, most of the money has been allocated. There are many troubles with spending it and so on, but the same government, not easily, with many deliberation and opposition from right-wingers inside the government. It took them, I think, 3 or 4 sessions to come to this decision. So maybe I'll just say the pressure was external pressure. The Israeli government promised the OECD that as part of being accepted as member to the OECD, it would take care of 2 communities which and make sure that they join the workforce. One of them is the Arab community and the other one is the Jewish ultra-Orthodox community. 2 communities that are behind in economic terms in Israel. So ambivalence is part of my lecture. I mean, if there is something which goes through everything I'm going to say, is this ambivalence also with regard to Jewish attitudes toward the Arabs, but also with regard to the Arab attitudes toward the state of Israel. And there was a member of Knesset by the name of Emir Habibi, who was also an author, a very known Arab author, passed away a few years ago. And he said it, he summarized it, I think, beautifully, saying, my country is at war with my people. My country, Israel, is at war with my people, the Arab people. Now, going back now to the beginning, the War of Independence in 1948, which we, the Jews, call the War of Independence, and the Arabs call the Nakba, a disaster in their eyes. Now, the Declaration of Independence, 1948, proclaims full equality for all Israeli citizens, including the Arabs. Looking at it 70 years later, this solemn pledge has not been kept in many ways. Right after 48, the Arab population was put under military government, which meant restrictions on movement, on traveling, exploitation, confiscation of land, curfews, and many other things that restricted their rights as citizens. They did participate, however, in the 1949 first election to the Knesset, which I think is quite remarkable given the fact that it was still during the war. The elections were, were held still during the war of 1948 and 49. And even though not many participated and so on, but the fact that Arab cities, and there were suggestions. I mean, I read in the archive some of the discussion in the provisional government. There were many people say, well, we're in the middle of the war, you know, the Arabs are enemies and so on, let's not, and Ben-Gurion at the end, for political reason, but also for democratic reason, said no, they're going to vote, and they became, as far as the formal rights, as full citizens. I'll repeat this sentence. Formally speaking, legally speaking, with the exception of the law that I mentioned before, legally speaking, Arab citizens are equal to non-Arab citizens. Now, the 1967, excuse me for jumping quickly, occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, again, made things very complicated. Obviously, it strengthened the bond between Palestinians inside Israel and Palestinians outside Israel. And of course, I would say without surprising you, that most Arabs in Israel feel for the Palestinians and identify with the struggle. So it makes it very difficult for them to support at least the occupation policy or even the security policy. On the Jewish side, the 1967 war fueled nationalistic and hawkish views, which continue until this very day, and even some messianic views, which have some elements that non-Jews are not part of the State of Israel enterprise. Two eruptions are to be mentioned during the period after that. One, demonstration against confiscation of Arab land in 1976 ended up with 6 Arab demonstrations killed by the Israeli police, and this event is now commemorized until this very day as the Land Day. Quite a shocking event in 1976. Much later, on October, and this was, I would say, in the days of the first Intifada, and even though it was within Israel, the Intifada was in the background of the police behavior. Then, in October 2000, during the second Intifada, violent clashes broke out between Arab demonstrators and again the police forces, and resulted in 12 Arab citizens killed and 1 Jewish citizen killed. This has caused the Arabs to say that the police opening fire proves that the State of Israel is ready to shed, I'm quoting, the blood of Arab citizens without good cause. Of course, it deepened even further the mistrust between the two sides. Now, by way of summarizing, I would say that on one hand, what I said shows that the Arabs in Israel went through a process of what is called Palestinization. Namely, they identified more as Palestinians, which, by the way, they didn't use this word before 1967. But on the other hand, surprisingly enough, they also went through a process of Israelization, namely becoming more used to the idea that they are Israeli citizens, demanding the rights, but focusing on the fact that they are Israelis. On surveys that ask, given the choice, would you go to a Palestinian state or remain in Israel? Great majority of Arabs in Israel say they would rather stay because they have the land and they are a native minority, but still they identify also as Israelis, not very happy with everything, but quite. Let me say quickly that looking at the social gaps, moving to the next subject, there is a separation in Israel between the two communities. And the two communities live let's say, apart from each other. The separation is on the basis of nationality, different nationalities, religion, culture, and language, of course, and even geography. With the exception of the mixed cities that I mentioned, Arabs live in their own towns, and there are very few mixed areas. There are major gaps between the Jewish population and the Arabs. I cannot go into all the things, but it starts very early with the low proportion of Arab 2-year-old kids in school. It evens up in high school. I mean, the number of Arabs going to high school is same as the Jewish part, but then at the university level, even though the numbers have increased dramatically, the Arabs who meet the university entrance requirements are much lower than the Jewish one. Standard of living there is significant gap. And if we take one example, the Israeli Bureau of Statistics divide all the local authorities in Israel into 10 parts. Number 10 is the richest one, or the highest standard of living. Number 1 is the lowest one. All the Arab local authorities, without exception, are in the first 5 categories. Namely, they are the lowest. In category 1 and 2, almost all of them are Arab local authorities. And when we talk about standard of living, I mean housing, education, employment. It's an aggregate index. And finally, I just coming here, I heard on the radio that another woman was killed in Tira, an Arab city. The violence, the level of violence in the Arab local authorities is just unbearable. I'm not exaggerating. The numbers are very high. I don't have it right now, but we are talking about internal feuds and internal killings within the Arab, which was high before the corona, but given the unemployment that's raised dramatically within the Arab community, which had the almost the highest rate, with the ultra-Orthodox, the highest rate of sick people, the number of unemployment, and it is now reflected in terrible levels of crime and violence within the Arab community, which of course calls for many changes. Now, let's move to politics. Okay, let me see how much time do I still have. Okay, we are fine. Let's divide it into periods. Of course, we divide periods in order to make our life easier, but of course, one runs into the other. The first period, let's say the first 30 years of the state until the 80s, was marked by the fact that Arab politics was more or less dominated by the Jewish parties. They were affiliated, I said, they had the right to vote, but they voted mainly for affiliated Arab parties, which were under supervision of the Jewish party, mainly the dominant Mapai Labor Party, and some other parties. So their representation was, they were in the Knesset, but one cannot say that they had the power to independently take care of their population. The only exception at that time was the Communist Party, which existed even before 48. It used to be a Jewish Arab Communist Party, of course, following the ideology. It increasingly became an Arab party, but still then and even today, there is always at least one member of Knesset, which is a Jewish member of Knesset within what used to be the Communist Party. Now it has many different names and so on. It got a lot of support, gradually more and more from Arab voters, not because they were communist, but because it represented independence, national feeling, the Communist Party, national feelings, and the aspiration of the Arabs. So the Communist Party always was independent in the Knesset. Most of the time it had about 4 members. Then it was not a big party, but I mentioned already Habiba and some of the others, prominent persons who made a remarkable mark on Israeli politics in general and on their community in particular. A gradual process started in the 80s. Independent Arab parties started to appear, and they replaced the old parties, so much so that some of the Jewish parties, mainly on the left, the Labor Party, Emeritus, and so on, made sure that they have at least one candidate in their list. Nowadays, that we have 10 members of the Arab parties in the last election, one of them Jewish, and there are 4 other Arabs in the Knesset representing 2 from Emeritus and 2 from other parties. So we have about 14 members in the Knesset. Let me say, by the way, that The Arab population in Israel is, as I said, around 20%, but in the terms of the voters, they are only 17%, because the Arab population in Israel is very young, under 18. So if we say they have 17% of the population, excluding East Jerusalem, they should have around 20. If all the Arabs voted for the Arab parties, and all of them voted, because they don't all vote, then they would have something like 20 members in the Knesset. Okay, so the gap has been decreasing slowly, but it has been decreasing. The interesting thing that I mentioned already was that in 2014, the threshold of entering the Knesset was raised. It used to be 1%, then 2%, and so on. It was raised to 3.25%. If you ask me why, I'll explain why this number. It allowed the Orthodox Jewish parties to enter. 3.25 means at least 4 members of the Knesset. In order to be in the Knesset, you have to have support for at least 4 members, which is roughly 3.25. The idea was mainly, or the stated idea was to decrease the number of parties, which, by the way, didn't occur. We still have the average of more than 10 parties in the Knesset, even with this threshold. But the other thing was that idea that the Arab parties, which were at that time very small, the 4 Arab parties that I mentioned already, they would not make it to the Knesset. Now, the irony of history is that exactly the opposite happened. In 1915 election, they united, to the surprise of everyone, because those 4 parties are not very happy with each other, to use an understatement, or to use a different. They are as rivalry to each other as the Jewish parties. I mean, those of you who know Israel know that we have quite a rough political system, and it's also rough within the Arab parties. To the surprise of everyone, including myself, they managed to join the so-called they managed to cooperate and establish the joint list, which in in the election of 2015 got 13 members of Knesset, the highest. Since then, they split and they reunited. Every time they reunited, they got more votes, and the level of participation among Arabs in the election rose. So when they split in 2019, they went down to 10, as they did the last election. Then they joined again, and in the March 20, I get confused with all the elections. I have to check. March 2020, they had the highest level ever. They had 15 members of the Knesset, and as I said, in the last election, they split again. 3 Arab parties remain in the joint party, and one, the United Arab List, headed by Abbas Mansour, got separated and got 4 members, but the level of participation went down from an average of 60, 65, still lower than the Jewish vote, and the level of participation went down to 55% in the last election in March, which means that almost half of the Arabs didn't vote. The Jewish percentage was 65, also very low compared to previously. I mean, people are tired of going to vote, but it was more dramatic among the Arabs, showing that they also are, first of all, not happy with the split and not with the parties. So, to summarize this part, let me say that Arabs vote in general, have not been able to translate their power into political clout. Compare, of course, to much smaller Jewish communities, such as the ultra-Orthodox, which are not much, which are even smaller, but have a lot of political power in the Knesset. We can say that they've been excluded from the coalition government, with the exception of the coalition, which I was at the government at the time, the coalition headed by Yitzhak Rabin, 1992, 1995, and then Peres another year, in which they were not officially members of the coalition, but they supported the coalition from the outside. And this was a period in which many of the policies changed in education, in infrastructure, and in many other areas. To give you one example, as the head of the civil service, I initiated getting Arab academics into the civil service. The numbers when I came in was very low. They were mainly the Arabs were mainly employed in Arab-speaking jobs, you know, in income tax or in so on, and only about 5% of the civil service. The Arabs were only 50% of civil service instead of 20. So we initiated a plan in which the Arabs were actually called to join the civil service. It was very successful because they really wanted to be part of the civil service. And it took a long time, but nowadays we are talking about something like 15%, also in the high echelons of the civil service, which was initiated during the Rabin government as part of the general effort of that government. Okay. Let me now move quickly, unless there are questions on what I've said so far, to the government policies and then my view. Okay. As I said, the Arab native minority, which remained in Israel. Let's not go now into the question of how many remain, how many were expelled. I'll be happy to answer a question if you want me to. But those who left, about 150 to 200,000 Arabs left within the borders of the new state of Israel. They had no leadership. Most of the leaders left. And of course, they were economically and in any respect in a very difficult situation. Also, because the Jewish majority viewed the Arab community as a security threat, fearful about their loyalty and also the identification with the Arab states or with those who remained in the West Bank, which at that time was occupied by Jordan. So the policies that I mentioned already was a military government, which lasted until 1966. 1 year before the Six-Day War, the military government was lifted and a major change happened. Now, why this change took place? There were many reasons, but I would like to mention there were also forces within the Jewish Israeli society and politics, parties, civil groups, voluntary groups that fought very hard to lift the military government. There were other reasons, but I would like to mention that as part of the effort because I also was personally involved, if I may. Now, in the 80s, the second period, Arab society started to change. More intellectuals, local leadership appeared. Some of the Jewish public became much more aware of the problems with the Arab minority, and also a great deal of support came from court decisions that started to make sure that discrimination, mainly regarding land confiscation, but in other areas would not be allowed. The courts played a very important role in making sure that the Arab rights gradually would be preserved. For instance, in many cases, Arab candidates were voted in the Knesset as eligible to run into the election. They appealed to the Supreme Court and were reinstated by the Supreme Court, to just give you one example. Now, moving quickly to let's say the last 20 years or so, major changes happened. I would like to say, even though I stated that the Arab situation is dire and still far from being satisfactory, gradual change occurred. And the Arab population community moved. There's no comparison between their economic status today to what was there, let's say, 20 years ago. Not enough, too slow, but there has been major changes. Let me point out to a few landmarks in this process. In 2007, the pre-Netanyahu government, the Arab Economic Development Authority was established, again, with pressure from the European Union and the OECD and so on. And for the first time, there was an authority in charge of working to alleviate the living conditions of the Arabs. This is very important, first of all, because there was one, and secondly, it was run by Arabs, not by Jews as before. To give an example, I remember once a good friend of mine said, "You were in government. Where is the place with all those decisions against the Arabs are taken? Tell me, you know." I said, "Very bad news for you. There's no such a place. The Arabs are ignored. It's not that somebody decided to be against it. We are talking now, not the early years. We're talking now about the 90s and so on." I said, "They are ignored." This authority had a symbolic effect that they are not ignored anymore. And as I mentioned before, the Netanyahu government later on established decided to have a comprehensive plan, and this, as I said, is important. It was integrated into the annual budget. I mean, it's not just something that plan. And here I would like to mention that the Bureau of the Budget was instrumental very much in getting this decision through. I mean, as I said, there was long discussion in the government. They wanted the Arabs to claim loyalty to the state, and some ministers wanted them to all kinds of conditions and so on. And the Bureau of the Budget, I heard it from the head said all the time, "Fine, you can do it, but you go to the OECD and tell them that you're not going to do it." That's what he told me about the whole thing. Anyhow, a plan was made, and as I said, it was implemented. This is very important, and there have been changes, mainly in the infrastructure, bus services, postal services, all the things that were the services level has been raised in the last 5 years. Not enough. Not all the money was spent. In the last 2 years, as part of our unstable democracy, we don't have a budget. We don't have a state budget. In the last 2 years, some of the monies that were due were not given. I think it's also important to mention some of the symbolic changes that occurred. They are small, but I think they show the change, as I said, slowly but surely coming up. An Arab won the Israel Prize. The speaker of the Knesset Award. There were appointment of first Arab justices to the Supreme Court and ambassadors to Arab ambassadors in foreign countries. The number of students increased, mainly women, by the way, Arab women now going to universities and colleges in many ways. There was more than one Israeli Arab minister in the government. And in terms of culture, there's recognition of Arabs on TV, artists, writers, and so on. On the symbolic level, you can see the change. And I would also mention that about 10 years ago, I think in 2007, the Academy of the Arabic language in Israel was established. Even though 10 years later, the law, the basic law on Israel as a Jewish nation, degraded the Arab language in Israeli, legally at least. At the same time, there is now an academy which takes care of the language. Again, this ambivalence, this on one hand, and the other hand, the situation. Let me just conclude and repeat what the ambassador said, that I also agree with him that the way that we treat our minority is one of the supreme tests of democracy. And if I may, I would add, for a state of Israel, for a Jewish state of Israel, I think it's even more so. I don't have to explain, but for people who were minorities, suffered as a minority, one would expect that they would develop a different way of doing. I'm not saying that other countries are doing better. I'm just saying that I would expect Israel to treat its minority in a much more sensitive way that we have been doing. And this special challenge, unfortunately, for many years, until recently, has not been met. Particularly with this definition of Israel as a nation state, which is very much against non-Jews, and in addition to the language, it also fixes the supremacy of Jewish holidays, calendar, and other things, all on the symbolic level, but symbols are very important also in our part of the world. I'm not going to mention many of the changes within the Arab community, but I would just give you one example. Starting in the early, in 2006, a series of documents appeared that are called the vision documents, and probably some of you heard them, in which the Arab intellectual community, academics, professionals, and so on, prepared 4 documents in which they stated the collective credo of themselves as Arabs, what they expect to be as Arab citizens, Palestinian Arab citizens of the State of Israel. Some of them were rather extreme, defining Israel as a colonial state, wanted to have a non-Jewish state, but most of them recognized the State of Israel and demanded their rights as equal citizens with community autonomy. So the demand for community, cultural, language, and so on, community is something which goes through most of them. I would say that some of those documents demanded also political community, and I, among others, was very much against it. It's one thing to recognize them as a separate native minority which has the right to have their own cultural autonomy and to run it as the way they want to, exactly as the ultra-Orthodox. It's another thing to have a political community which is almost borders on a binational state, which I think is impossible. Like, we can talk about it. But more important, it means that all the Arabs would vote for Arab parties. Nowadays, some of them vote for Jewish parties. Some Jews vote for Arab parties. I mean, we are citizens on the citizen levels. We are separated, but there are many bridges, which would mean that there would be a fixed number of members of parliament. This would, I think, be against the whole idea of having a state which belongs to all its citizens, Jewish, Arabs, and others. So if I may now end with my suggestion, I think there are many solutions, but the solution is relatively simple. Again, if I may quote another Arab friend, he said, I don't understand why the state of Israel is still investing so much effort to get Jews to come to Israel. I mean, those who want to come, they came already, and you're wasting a lot of efforts and money. Take us, he said, take us, the Arabs. We'll be your new immigrants. It would be easier for you. We know the language, we know the place, we are more or less integrated, many of us in the economy, and most of all, we don't need what is called the basket of services that you give but just regard us as your new immigrants. I thought that was a wonderful, funny, ironic idea. I think this is the way I would suggest going. The state will have to recognize the Arabs as a distinct community of Israeli citizens. And it means that they would recognize their collective rights, as I said, in language, education, culture, and of course, religion. But they should be entitled to conduct their own affairs autonomously. We'll have a joint political system. We'll have one Knesset. They would be represented the way they've been represented so far. We'll have to agree if they have autonomy, as we try to do with the ultra-Orthodox without great success, the Jewish ultra-Orthodox. There would be need for agreements on issues excuse me, such as core curriculum in schools, or the question of military service or civilian service in the army, but their collective rights would not enhance political separatism. Arab citizens should be a distinct national minority, but the national aspiration cannot be realized within the state of Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yitzhak Garnur, for this very interesting and detailed presentation that covered all of Israel's history in one way or another. And also introduced us, I think, to many aspects of the topic that not all of us would be familiar with. There was one question during your talk coming from Sasha Munstein. Sasha, would you like to speak this question, or shall I read it from the chat? Either way is fine with me.
Yeah, just read it. Thank you, Mitchell.
All right. The question was, do you think that some of these statistics, such as the different rates of academic achievement and the crime rate, are due to, among other things, cultural factors? Do you think that there is equal opportunity in principle? Those are actually two questions.
Yes, well, I don't think that cultural thing, because there is also crime in the Jewish community. We are not free of that. And the levels have increased dramatically. So if it's a cultural thing, it should have been there before. I think that mainly the young people, the Arab young people are frustrated, some of them nationally, but most of them economically. And this, I think, is the main reason. I think that it should be as simple as that. Now, the second question was?
Do you think there is equal opportunity in principle?
Well, no. I mean, let's start with the obvious. I mean, if an Arab wants to rent a house in Tel Aviv, he may encounter problems. And I have to say it frankly, because, you know, there's still discrimination. In terms of equality, there has been a change in many ways. Now we have Arabs mainly in the health system. Many physicians, doctors are Arabs or nurses and so on, dramatically shown during the last year. And as I said, you see many of them in places that I didn't see them before. I mean, it's going very slow. I'm afraid, I mean, somebody asked me, you know, how long will it take? I said, too long. I don't know how long, but there is no full equal opportunity. But there is change. You find Arabs in the high-tech companies in Israel, not in the big ones. They don't get those exits and so on, but you have high-tech. There are members of them in many places. You find them, as I said, in culture, in cinema, and so on. I would like to see the pace of this become much more quicker.
Let me just repeat what I said at the beginning of the talk about the chat function. If you have a question, you are welcome to simply write it into the chat or say in the chat that you have a question, and then I will call on you. Either way is perfectly all right. While we're waiting for people to ask questions or say that they have a question, I would like to ask one to you myself. You have referred in your thesis, in your text that introduced this talk, to the Arab nation. I find that very interesting. What do you mean when you speak of an Arab nation?
Oh, you're going to get me in trouble. I can see that. Thank you. Well, let me start why I don't think there's going to be a possibility of a binational state. I mean, some of the proposals are that Israel will become a binational state. There are practical reasons why this is impossible, but there is also a reason which is related to the national aspiration of both sides. I can say that the Jews in Israel are still struggling. Who is a Jew? And, you know, what is a Jew? And, you know, what the religious aspect and so on. Similarly, with my, acquaintance of Arab, they also are struggling. Are we Muslims? Are we Christians? Are we Arabs? Are we Palestinians? Are we part of the Arab nation and so on? This question is, I would say 30 years ago or during the Nasser period of nationalism, Arab nationalism was at its peak. Nowadays, Arab nationalism is not as strong as it is. So what I meant is that given the fact that the Arabs are not Jews, they have a different national identity. They are different. Now, to go and say what is the difference, whether they are different because they are Arabs, different because they are Palestinians, because they are Arab Muslims, or because they are Palestinians Muslim, part of the Middle East and so on. This is something that I'm not going to take upon myself to say. But nationally, they feel as a separate community. And in those vision papers that I mentioned, it appears we are a separate nationality. The Arabs who wrote it say. So I accept it. If they want to be different, fine.
This is, I raised the question not only to provoke you, but because there is a distinction, at least in principle, between speaking of a people and speaking of a nation.
Yes.
And no one knows this better than Jews. This is the central dilemma of the Jewish state in many respects. Are we talking about a state of the Jewish people, as the law stated in 2018, in which case the majority of Jews who don't live in Israel are somehow part of that, even though they aren't actually citizens? That makes it very strange in many respects, but of course it's the legal basis for allowing Jews to come to Israel and automatically become citizens without having ever lived in the country. That's a quite unusual arrangement, shall we say. Yes. But one in the past, it had been more common to speak of the Arabs as an ethnicity, and as an ethnicity which exists in multiple nations, which is a different thing than speaking of one Arab nation.
Yes. Yes, well, ethnicity is not used anymore as it used to be because, first of all, there are Palestinians on inside Israel and Palestinians outside, so they don't think that this is an ethnic question, the way we used to say it. I think when they say we are a separate nationality, they mean they want to have their rights to their culture. Part of it Arab, part of it Muslim, part of it Christian, and so on. It's a more cultural, so you may say ethnic, but I just use the term that they used. I was involved in one of those documents. They invited me to talk about it. And I said, well, if you want to emphasize the differences, this is easy. Try also to see what is common for us as citizens. I mean, I'm nationalistic Jewish, okay? And I'm a Zionist even. Not not in Zionist, Zionist in the sense that I think that the Jews have the right to have self-determination, not a messianic Zionist, for God forbid. But they insisted on saying, no, it's a national rights. And I said, well, you talk about community, no, so with national rights. So I accept it as a definition. I agree with you completely. The law, the basic law, Israel is a nation of the Jewish people, is, how shall I be polite, something that I hope is going to be erased. This is politely from the Constitution of Israel. For the reason that you mentioned, I didn't mention that not all Jews want to be part of Israel. Why should they if they don't feel like? But it didn't change practically anything, but it worked on the symbolic level, saying to the Arabs, you are not part of the state. And they reacted accordingly. Even not only the Muslims, but also the Christians and the Druze, which feel a bit closer to the state of Israel. So it's not me saying it. They saw in it a declaration that they are not welcomed in the state of Israel.
I have at least two more questions now on the chat. Thank you for those of you who have taken the trouble to ask questions. Georg Gapmeyer asks, what do Arab children learn in school about the history of Israel, starting from the 1920s?
Within the state of Israel, there is a curriculum, and they are supervised by the Ministry of Education. The books are supervised closely. I don't think that there is much of a difference. I don't think there is nationalistic or any other content. Certainly not racist in the schools, the Arab schools in Israel. It's different in the Palestinian Authority, if that was hinted in the question. It is supervised by the Ministry of Education. I would say that they have less autonomy than the ultra-Orthodox schools, in which there's no supervision by the state of Israel. There's supervision by their own community. And some of them don't study English. I'm talking about the Jewish ultra-Orthodox. They don't study English, they don't study math and so on. In terms of basic education, the Orthodox Jews in Israel are much more of a problem than the Arab community.
Thank you.
Let me give you an example. For instance, going into the university, now we have more ultra-Orthodox try to get to the university. They are completely out of it. Whereas the Arabs, they go through the school system. Some of the schools are inadequate in terms of level, but they have no problem because they learn all the basic skills. So with some help and so on, they make it. And, in our department, there are many Arab students and they have no problems. They know the language, they know everything.
So the next question is from Alexander Ratzina. Alexander, would you like to state your question or shall I read it for you? Either one's fine.
Please go ahead and read it. It's fine.
Okay. The question is, what is the number of Jews living in Israel whose origins are in Arab countries? Are they Arab Jews, Jewish Arabs, neither?
Oh, well, this is as complicated as a question about the nation. I'll give you an answer which is a very responsible one. We don't know nowadays what is the division within the Jewish community between the Westerns and the Oriental, between the Ashkenazi and so on. Reason being, we are already into the third and fourth generation, and the number of Israelis who come from mixed families is increasing steadily. So we don't know how to where to put them. However, let's go back a few years ago. Let's say in the 80s, I studied the number of intermarriages. I was interested at that time. It was possible because in the Bureau of Statistics, there was a way of identifying. And the question of intermarriage, my friend was the head of statistical office. I asked him, can you give me the information, the statistics? He said yes. And I discovered, in talking about the 80s, that the number of intermarriage between Jews, Oriental Jews, and Western Jews is on the increase. At that time, it reached 30%, which was quite surprising. I mean, even then, with the second and third generation, now we have the third and the fourth. Excuse me, I have a cold. Then in the 90s, the curve went down dramatically. Why? Russian immigration to Israel. The Russians don't mix. They marry either Ashkenazi or their own. When Russians, I mean, those who came from the ex-Soviet Union, it include Georgians and Ukrainians and so on. They didn't go. They didn't intermarry with Orientals. Back in 2005, I think I looked at it again, and the numbers started to raise again. So it's now over 30, I think 35 and so on. Mind you, we don't want to get into 100%, right? Because then there would be no marriages within the Ashkenazi. 50% is good enough, right? That's what we want. So it's on the increase. Today, I would say that those who identified themselves as Orientals, namely that their fathers and they were born in the Orient, in the Arab countries or North Africa, is very small. I don't know, but yeah, I would say a lot more than just off my cuff, 20%. Most, as I said, are already second and third generation. Impossible to identify them because we have to go back and find out. This problem in Israel is on its way out, if I may say so. It may take a long time, but with intermarriage and what is happening in the economy and so on, I, among others, think that the other problems of Israel, religion, Arabs, economy, social gaps, and so on, much more difficult and much more stubborn than the others. Of course, there are many people in Israel, some of my intellectual friends, that are still saying, but the statistics goes against them.
That what you just said leads quite nicely into the next question from Sasha Munstein again. How would you allocate the percentages of factors that distinguish the Arab citizens in Israel? You've mentioned ethnic, economic, religious, and political features, or shall we say identifications or issues. You just did the same again, but I guess what Sasha is trying to do, please correct me, Sasha, if I'm wrong, is asking you to weight them, which is the most important. And which is less important. Can
you repeat the
ethnic, economic, religious, and political factors?
Well, I don't know how to do it, really, frankly. I don't know how to do it because they're mixed. If you take the younger generation of Arabs, Muslims, let's say, they are still religious, but certainly less religious than their parents. The Christians are most of them are secular. The Druze serve in the armies, or they become part of Israeli society. I don't know how you can separate, because identities, even though we try to separate, I think that they are mixed. Even the language is a problem for Arabs. When we tried to get Arabs into the civil service that I mentioned before, we published the tenders and the request in Arab newspapers, of course. And then I get a call from an author, an Arab author, a friend of mine also, and he said, well, it's very nice of you that you publish it in the Arab newspapers, but if you want Arab academics to join the civil service, publish in Idiot Achronot in the Jewish paper. I said, you're kidding. He said, no. They read the Jewish papers, not the Israeli papers, not the Arab papers, and so on. So how would you see, this is difficult. The whole thing is not clear-cut between Arab and Jews, but it's also not clear-cut with regard to the ingredients of their identity. It's a society in terms of their own identity. As I said, a lot of ambivalence still exists. And excuse me for not being able to answer your question properly.
I have two more questions. Perhaps you could call it three, because I'm going to attach a question of my own to the next question. from Georg Gabmeier again. He asks, what do Arabs think about Hamas and Hezbollah? And my question relates to that. I was going to ask, are Arabs still considered the Arabs in Israel still considered to be a security threat?
Well, again, let's start with facts. The number of Arab citizens of Israel that have been involved in any security threat, in sabotage, in so on, since the beginning of the state. That's something that has been researched in Israel until 2003, I think, about 20 years ago. I don't know later on. The percentage of Arabs involved in any act against Israel is less than 1%. I think it's point number 6 or 7. It's amazing. When I say to the Israelis, they say, no, it's impossible. I say, no, Arabs in Israel are loyal to the state of Israel, very much so. Also to Israeli democracy, by the way, it shows they are much more now keen to preserve Israeli democracy than the Jewish, the surveys show. So I don't know exactly how many of them support Hamas. I hope not too many. But remember that the same question was asked, how many of them supported the PLO at the time, and many of them did support, but then the PLO became partner of the state of Israel for a long time. So I wouldn't think that this is a criteria for judging their loyalty to the state. I think that most of them are loyal, very much loyal. Is this a view that is shared by a majority of the Jewish community in the state of Israel? Unfortunately, no. Majority of the Jewish people still regard the Arabs as a threat, or they may one day want to become part of the Palestinian state, which again is not true, or become part of the Middle East Arab state and so on. In the surveys, most Israelis, most Jews in Israel still regard Arabs not as an immediate threat, but as a security problem, unfortunately.
Our last question comes from our board member, Doron Rabinovich. What would be the key demands of Mansour Abbas's Arab Islamist? Oh, there's another one. I'm sorry. I just see a new one. So we got two more. So Doron's question was, what would be the key demands of Mansour Abbas's Arab Islamist Party to support a coalition? As he stated them apparently on television. So
yes, I can only repeat what he said on television. He said that we want the Arabs in Israel to be equal to the Jews in Israel, which means raising the level of all services, education, housing, post office. He mentioned specifically having police stations in the Arab cities and villages. He talked about the infrastructure, roads, bus services, and so on. I think that he more or less would take the list that I went through and presented. More interesting is what would be his demands when the government, if you support the government, makes a move against the Palestinians, or something which he as a Palestinian would disapprove, or would make a move against his Islamic beliefs. I mean, this could be a problem. He doesn't talk about it. He understood quite accurately this demand, which I mentioned, of Israelization, not as Palestinization. He took this side. And I think that if he gets guarantees that the government is going to provide those services, or even, let's say, if the government would decide to continue to have another 5-year plan as the previous one, with him perhaps, involved personally, maybe he's a politician, I think he would be willing to do it. I think so. And if I may say so, without any knowledge or any proof, I think he thinks, I'm not sure, but I think he thinks that he can get it from the right-wing government more than he can get it from the left-wing government. I think so. I think that's what his idea. So, well, we'll see. We have another.
We'll see if Netanyahu can form a majority without the Arab Party. That's the problem.
No, he cannot. He cannot. That's the interesting. Even if the right-wing Yemina, the going right, headed by Bennett, would join, they still have 59. So he's really, sitting there as the pivot, which he really wanted to do. He got himself seated on this hot seat of 60. Remember the Knesset? With him, he could decide which coalition is going to be built. Well, and nobody knows. I mean, I know that even his ex-friends in the joint party, I asked them, what is going to do? They say, we don't know. We don't know what he's going to do. I think that he's waving a little bit, but given the choice, he may decide to join the Netanyahu government.
So as they say in my homeland, stay tuned. The last comment is from Sasha Munstein. It's Munstein again. It's a question rather than a comment. It's a nice little thing, a nice note for our conclusion. In reference to the question above about identity, he writes, I knew a teacher of German literature at Brandeis University, an elderly, very distinguished Reich-Ranitskian gentleman radiating German culture. I asked him, would you not regard yourself as German, or are you an American? And he answered, I am a German origin American Jew. I suppose it would be very nice if we could get to the point in Israel where such exchanges were even possible, but it doesn't seem like we're there just yet. I mean, even when Joe Biden can say he's Irish and nobody takes that as a political statement of the kind that would cause
moving, I hear Arabs stating on television, I am a Palestinian Arab citizen of the State of Israel. It's almost like it's a long way of presenting themselves. And I said, in addition, I'm also professor of law and this and that and that. I have many identities on television, which is, I think is very, this couldn't happen even 10 years ago.
We do have one final question from Justina Demsio about the attitudes of young people. Is there any difference in the attitude of young Jews towards Arabs compared to the older generation?
I haven't seen any surveys on that. So you're asking about my speculation or my opinion. The Israeli young people are not very much different than the not young people. Let's say in terms of voting and so on. Israeli young people are not rebels. The students are usually, when we used to do surveys of voting among the military people and so on, and everybody said they are right wing and so on. Not at all. They more or less distributed their votes exactly as their parents, more or less, with some exception. If there was somebody who was charismatic and so on, even though he didn't make it to the Knesset, if it was up to the soldiers, the young soldiers in Israel are 18 to 21. Okay, so this is a good way of representing them. This is not the total population, but it was a good way of representing them. And I'm talking about service done in the past. They were more or less dividing their votes with some exceptions for, small parties and so on, but not as most Israelis assume that the young people are more right-wing. An old Labor voter who died, or a young Likud member was born. That's what you said. I used to say, as a joke. Not anymore. So, I mean, it's not divided according to age in Israel. But as I said, I haven't seen figures lately on that. This is my own estimation of the situation.
Thank you very much, Yitzhak Golnoa, for your open and clear responses to the many questions that came from our audience. And thank you to the members of our audience for being willing to ask some questions via the chat function. I would like to ask our General Secretary, Blandina Buranes, to tell us about our next event.
First of all, I also want to thank you all for participating, and a big thank you to Daraba, Professor Galnour. It was an outstanding lecture. Thank you, Mitch, for a fantastic moderation, and Ambassador Briggs for being our cooperation partner. Our next event will be in May, and currently there is an outstanding exhibition at the Albertina, and it's on photography, and one of the protagonists is Helma Larsky. And we will take the opportunity to learn more about this person. He is a pioneer in photography and filmmaker, and I'm inviting all of you to join us. You will get the information when it will take place and the exact title of our next lecture. Thank you very much for this wonderful evening.
And thank you again, and I wish you all a pleasant evening.
Thank you for sharing it. I really appreciate it.